Wednesday, April 27, 2005. We're here today in the beautiful new Judiciary Building of the Iowa Supreme Court. And today we're with former Justice Louis W. Schultz, who was appointed to the Iowa Supreme Court on August 19, 1980, upon the retirement of Justice Warren J. Reese. Justice Schultz was born in Deep River, Iowa on March 24, 1927. He attended Central College in Pella, Iowa, and then later went to Drake University and received a LLB degree in 1949. Justice Schultz is also a World War II veteran of the United States Navy. He practiced law in Marengo, Iowa for more than 15 years. He served as an Iowa County attorney from 1960 through 1968 and as a district court judge for the 6th Judicial District for 9 years beginning in 1971. Justice Schultz retired in 1993 after having written 335 opinions for the Iowa Supreme Court. We're here today to ask him to share with us some of his memories about his practice before he went on the bench, being a county attorney, being a district court judge, and being on the Iowa Supreme Court. Thank you very much for doing this, Justice Schultz. Would you like to start off by telling us a little bit about your parents and the family you grew up in?
Mm-hmm. My parents were farmers. The first 12 years of their marriage, or 13 I believe, they were tenant farmers. They purchased a farm in about 1939. My parents did not have a lot of education. My father, I think, went to the 6th or 7th grade and then had to work on the farm. However, he said that he went till he was 18 or 19 to the country school in the wintertime. My mother went to the 8th grade, despite the fact that her parents both graduated from high school. So but my mother was very heavy on education and stressed it very much.
Respected it.
She respected it, yes she did.
And wanted you to have one, I take it.
Yes. And I was the oldest in the family, and my brother followed behind me, and he also graduated from Drake. He had an economics degree, but he came here on a basketball scholarship. He was about 8 inches taller than I am, and he played basketball and baseball at Drake. He ended up being a banker and secretary-treasurer of the National Banking Association, president of the local one, was on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and I'm certain that his occupation provided him with a better retirement than mine. But my sister then followed him, and she was a school administrator for several years in San Francisco and retired a couple of years ago. So my family went from, I had no uncles, aunts, or cousins who had gone to college, except one branch of the family had 7 or 8 or 9 pastors of churches who had gone through seminary, but that was very fine.
I see.
And actually my mother expected me to do that. And when I didn't, I did tell her at the time I got appointed to the Supreme Court, see, I wear a black robe just like the preachers do.
Made amends that way.
Yeah.
Did you graduate from high school in Deep River?
I did. In my earlier years, we moved to, I think, 3 different farms. During that 13 years, my dad was a tenant farmer, and I attended those little schoolhouses that they had on every section of land.
The proverbial one-room schoolhouse.
Yeah, and that was quite an experience. Well, it was really an experience when I went to high school from there, because that was probably the worst day of my life. I was scared to death to go to that town of around 325 people to go to a high school with 50 or 60 kids in it, but I survived.
And your dad farmed during the Depression, it sounds like.
He had about probably 5 or 6 real good years before the Depression took place, but he got hit with having a 3-year cash rent situation, and which ended, I think, in 1934. And he was very proud of the fact that he did not seek the aid of some statutes the legislature had passed that would have given him some aid in reducing the rent, because he said he'd made a contract and he always paid his debts. But when we moved off of that farm, most of our livestock was gone and so forth, and we kind of started over. But he did a good job, but his philosophy changed quite a bit during that time. He wasn't, I don't think things were as important to him as they were before. He was very prosperous the first few years and had several hired men and so forth. And after he bought a farm, he had 160 acres, and things had kind of calmed down for him.
You, after you told us 2 years at Central College, you moved on to Drake University.
Right.
And went to law school directly then from?
Right. I'd gone, it's kind of a long story, but I had I had joined the Navy Air Corps, the V-5 program in 1943, and I needed 3 things. I had to graduate from high school, become 17, and get my parents' consent. And when I graduated from high school in early in 1944, I went to get my parents' consent. My mother said no. So she said, if you'll spend a semester in college, I'll sign them. And that's why I went to, I had not anticipated going to college at any time, especially that year. But I did, and a new world opened up for me.
So she really knew better in the long run.
She did. I did join the Navy the following spring and went on, and I had about 3 weeks of school left, but the Central College dean said, anyone going in service and that only has that much time, you just talk to your professors, but we are going to get full credit. So I really didn't have quite a year in, but I did outline all my courses to the end and wrote some papers and so forth. And then I went into boot camp, and from there to hospital corps school out in Farragut, Idaho. And after graduating from there, at the time, just before I graduated, Harry dropped those bombs on Japan, and I was very thankful.
Yes, indeed. Okay, that's good. And after did you serve much then after the end of the war?
Got discharged late in, or around the 1st of August in 1945. And in the meantime, I was on a hospital ship for a while, and then on a APA where we carried a lot of wives of officers to the Philippines and brought back quite a few hundred troops that had been in on the Filipino campaign and been stuck at Subic Bay area.
So then you went back to Pella after you...
Then I went back to Pella, finished out the year, looked for a job for that following summer, which was the summer of '47. Couldn't find one, and my fellow I played a little football with, Jim Kempkes, had graduated, and he couldn't get a job except paving streets. And his mother said he had a degree, he had just graduated, and his mother told him she wasn't going to have a college graduate working on the streets. He said, why don't we go over and see if Drake will let us into law school? We did, and I took my transcript over, and we visited with the dean's secretary, and 20 minutes later we were told to report to school next Monday.
And this is Martin Tollefson era of Drake?
That was Martin Tollefson. He was the dean at that time.
Okay. And then graduated from Drake Law School in 1949.
Yes, we went, the people that I started with, half of them flunked out because that was the custom at that time. And the other half, most of us graduated in the fall of 1949, which meant 3 summer schools and 4 semesters. And we stayed kind of our nose to the grindstone. It wasn't that difficult because summer jobs and things like that just weren't available at that time.
You had a GI Bill.
I had a GI Bill that covered most of my law school education. I had enough money saved up from my service days to pay the rest of it.
Were you married by the time you graduated from law school?
No.
Okay, so the next thing that happens is you start looking for a job out of law school.
And that was, I happened to, on the August graduates, I probably had the top grades in that group. There were some very smart guys that graduated in June, but the dean Tollefson gave me the only leads he had for places to practice law. The first one I went to see, they said, we hired somebody from Iowa the day before. Why didn't you come sooner? And I said, the dean wasn't here. He was at summer camp. And I talked to 2 of the others, and it just wasn't possible. I had another handicap. I was still 22 years old. And fact is, I think I was the youngest. When I passed the bar later that fall, I was the youngest lawyer in Iowa for a year or 2. But
so by 22, you'd been in the service, college, and graduated from law school.
Right. Well, I skipped some grades back in grade school, and I wouldn't suggest that to anybody because I was a rather inexperienced, immature law graduate.
Was Harry Perkins a classmate of yours?
Harry was a semester behind me. Okay. Fact is, I think he was a summer school behind me. And Harry was one of my best friends. When we were the last 2 years in law school, Harry and myself and a fellow by the name of Reed were the 3 people that helped run the Drake Law Library at nights and on weekends. We got paid about 35 cents an hour, but you could do a lot of studying while you're on duty. Harry became a district judge, and Reed became a 4-star general in JAG and the dean of the South Dakota Law Schools. And there was one other, there were 4 of us, and the other one was Bert Prunty, and he went on to Columbia and then became a law professor at New York City College, and then the dean of the Maine Law School. So the rest of those guys were pretty successful.
Well, I'd say they all were. Okay, so you're out there looking for a job in 1949.
Yeah, I finally got a job, and I think it was only because I was a farm boy, and that was with the Iowa Farm Mutual, which was the Farm Bureau's casualty company, and they took a chance on me, and I worked for them for 6 years. But I made trips almost monthly looking around for a place to practice law. But the insurance company was very good to me, and although I only started out with a salary of $225 a month, that soon got raised, and I did real well with them. But I had a chance to go practice law in my home county, and that's what I wanted to do. I wondered about my wife. She was from Des Moines, but I took her down and showed her Marengo, and I don't know if she was too thrilled with it, but we stopped in and saw her parents who lived in Des Moines, and my father-in-law ran a cleaning shop out in Highland Park, and he settled it. He said, get your fanny out of working for a corporation, go to work for yourself. And my wife decided she wanted to go live in Marengo, and we did.
Okay, so maybe we ought to catch up on your married life here before we get to Marengo. Obviously, between graduating from law school and leaving for Marengo, you met someone, and
Yes, I had met Jean when I was a senior in law school, and we were married the fall of 1949. We have 3 lovely children. My daughter is 52. She's practicing law in Saipan, which, if you're not acquainted with that area, is north of Guam.
the Micronesia.
She's been, yeah, it's a seat of government for Micronesia. And she has a very prosperous and lucrative law practice out there with a Honolulu-based firm, beautiful home, and a lot of tropical plants in her yard. Their home is up about 1,200 feet on the side of a mountain and overlooks the bay. Her husband's also a lawyer, but he is a law clerk for the federal judge out there. I think he's had 15 years or 16 or 17 years as a law clerk. My oldest son is going to be 50 this year. He's a practicing physician up at Storm Lake in family practice, and likes it up there very much. My youngest son is in Iowa City, and he had done mechanical engineering type work, and is now the head of the Iowa City School District's buildings. And there's a lot of people, like janitors and other people, that report to him, and they're all happy with their jobs, and we're very pleased with all 3 of them.
Oh, that sounds great. Well, tell us a little bit about getting started in Marengo. Did you go to practice with someone else there?
I went with a gentleman by the name of Paul Harned. Paul was a very fine trial lawyer, and his firm had always, well, it went back to 1898 or 9, was known as Popham and Havener. And Popham became a district judge in the early, about 1914 or 16 or something like that. And Havener became Attorney General, I believe, in 1918, and held that position for about 4 years. And he had 2 younger lawyers in there by the name of Hatter and Harned. And so it was the 3 H's then. And when Havener decided he wanted to be governor and campaigned on banning the blue laws in Iowa, and he lost by just a few hundred votes, and then he decided to practice law in Des Moines, and the firm became Hatter and Harned. And they were essentially a trial firm, and very good at it. I had made my mind up that I wanted to do probate work and tax work and that type of stuff. And when I got in with Paul, a month later, during the middle of tax season, as we called it then, I was down helping him do a jury case. And we tried several jury cases a year for several years, and that he was a stickler on detail, and he was just a fine lawyer, and I wish I could have been half as good as he was.
Tell me what your starting salary was working for him.
He recognized the fact that I had had a couple of promotions, and in fact, the day I quit, I'd been offered a job as assistant claims manager over the whole claims department, and I was only 28 then, and I turned it down to go to Marengo. But Paul knew that, and he says, "We're going to do something different than anybody else. You're coming in as a partner. You start out at 25% of us and work up to 50 in 5 years," and that was.
He was good to his word.
But I'll also tell you, the first year I made less than half of what I was making with the insurance company. But in the third year, I think I made more than the district judge did, and I think I exceeded the judge's pay by quite a bit every year after that.
My goodness. Well,
Gives you some idea about the judicial pay.
yeah. What influenced you to be a lawyer, Justice Schultz?
Back when I was in this little rural school, we had about 10 or 12 kids, and they had a little library which consisted of some shelves with books on it, and there were maybe 100 books beside a Britannica encyclopedia. And they had a couple of books on Abraham Lincoln, and I probably read those, each one of them, 3 or 4 times. And used to tell the tales of him making the circuit back in Illinois, and I thought, boy, that would be, wouldn't have described it at that time this way, but I thought that'd be a cool profession. Mm-hmm. And so I had my heart set on it, but I also thought there wouldn't be a chance that I could ever do it. And at the first summer school, I was wondering about it too, because I saw everybody dropping out, and the good dean, who did so much for me later, gave me a D+ in constitutional law. And I had the other 2 courses I took that summer, I got very good grades in. But that taught me a lesson that I shouldn't play semi-pro baseball in the summertime. And then next semester I practically lived in the law library and studying, and I think I got 4 A's and a B+. And that was the best semester I had in law school. But I loved law school, and as you might guess, I love being a lawyer.
Was your practice in Marengo a general practice?
It was general practice, trial-oriented. I imagine every lawyer got to court once in a while, but we did. We represented a lot of insurance companies, and we did trial work for other lawyers, and so we had that strange combination. We considered ourselves to be trial lawyers, but also general practitioners, and that makes it a little more difficult.
Mm-hmm. That's right. It's keeping up with everything is hard to do. Tell us, I assume your practice prospered, but at some point you became county attorney.
Yes. I did that mostly because my partner was getting older, and he didn't want to go to the courthouse as much anymore, and this gave me an opportunity to try cases, and I found out that I didn't like property law as well. Right. And I hated tax work, even though I did a lot of it. But I actually enjoyed probate work very much, because you felt you were doing a real service to a lot of elderly widows and people who need some help on getting readjusted after the loss of a loved one.
Sure. Any other people influential in your life and the path you chose here, besides, as I said, your partner, and reading the books about Abraham Lincoln, your mother, obviously, and insisting
my
you go
mother
to
and
college?
my father, he wasn't as, I think he would have just soon I stayed on the farm. But I had a high school principal. The first couple of years in high school, I wasn't very studious, and I was very young. And he called me in on my junior year and said, "I see your schedule." He said, "You've got the 4 easiest subjects you can find, and that's a minimum." He tore up my card in front of me and tossed it to me and said, "I've prepared a new one for you." And he was also my baseball and basketball coach. And I said, "I don't have to take 6 courses, and I don't have to take these." And he says, "I know you don't." But he says, you're going to gather a lot of splinters on the bench if you don't. And he said, I want you to carry a book home every night. And he said, preferably 2 of them. And I did. And after about 10 days, I think it's the only time my parents ever asked to have a conference with me, and she got the other kids in another room and said, are you having some trouble in school? And I said, no. Have you done something? I said, no. And I said, why? And then, well, you're carrying books home and you're studying every night. And I said, I decided that maybe I ought to get something out of high school. And they couldn't quite believe it, but they did when they saw my report cards, because I got straight A's all the rest of the way through high school. And I owe that man a lot. He also came out to see my mother when I graduated from high school and said, Lou has got to go to college. And my mother said, I thought so.
That's great.
And the sad thing about it is, about 10 years later, I picked up the register one morning and saw that this fellow who was a superintendent of schools down in southern Iowa had embezzled some school lunch funds and got 5 years in the pen for it. And I always felt bad.
That's too bad. Well, can you tell us a little bit about the trial practice you were in? I take it were you mostly on the defense side then when you did trial work?
Originally, yes, because we had mostly insurance clients and banks for clients, but they did a amazing thing the result was amazing. They completed Interstate 80 through Iowa County, and our insurance defense work probably dropped off 75% because Highway 6, they had the interstate completed to Iowa City and finally to Grinnell, and then you got on Highway 6, and I think there were 28 deaths, automobile deaths in my little rural county the year before Interstate 80 was completed.
Good
the
for
year
business,
after, and since then there's 2 or 3 a year, and so it cut down on our defense work considerably, and all of a sudden plaintiffs started coming in, and I did more plaintiffs work the last 3 or 4 years I practiced than I did defense work. So I was on both sides of the table.
And I think that it helps to do both sides. I think you know your way around better both sides, and keeps your balance and your thinking.
I think so also.
Tell me, did you at some point you decided you wanted to become a judge, a district court judge? Yeah. And did you campaign for? How did you go about that in Iowa County?
I didn't campaign. We had a strange situation. It was a 2-county, 2-judge district. The old 8th district, I think, was a number. And back when Horace Havner was Attorney General, he or somebody got through the legislature that one of those judges had to come from Iowa County. And that stayed on the books until we redistricted and had new things. And consequently, we were used to having a judge from our county, even though there were only 16, 18 lawyers in the county. So when Paul Naughton, who preceded me, he was between Judge Gaffney, who had been a judge there for 40 years, and Naughton, when Naughton had to retire because he was having some illness, I think probably I was a logical candidate. Well, just about that time we did this reorganization, and we were put into a larger district, and Paul had served on it, and it was kind of I knew most of the lawyers in Cedar Rapids, and so I didn't have to campaign, and I was real fortunate to get nominated, and Governor Ray picked me. So
this is in this. This is while we were appointed judges. So you were nominated by the local Judicial Nominating Commission, and Governor Ray appointed you. And that was to the 6th Judicial District, which, as you mentioned, included Lynn County. Goes quite a bit east of where you are, all the way over to Jones, as I recall.
Lynn, Jones, Tama,
Johnson,
Benton, Iowa, and Johnson. And it's the same district.
But it's a long drive from Marengo to Anamosa for a court.
It was, and I, for a couple of years, didn't get sent there. But I would not sit in Iowa County, Marengo, because my younger law partner was involved in almost all the litigation in the county, and it just I would have to disqualify myself repeatedly, so I deliberately asked not to be assigned there, and I did not sit in Iowa County until I was a judge 5 or 6 years.
Did you enjoy the district court work?
It was a lot of fun. You asked me about why I wanted to become a judge. I think probably the biggest reason is the stress was really getting to me on the practice. I think trying to be a trial lawyer and also a general practitioner is very difficult. And when I went on to district court, that was the easiest job I'd had in a long time. Yeah, because most of the things I had done was the things that daily happened there. And I suddenly realized I couldn't get beat anymore. I wasn't going to lose.
Well, that is a comforting thought, isn't it, at times? I gather you enjoyed being on trial work on the bench, and most of that in Cedar Rapids?
It was, and half the time he'd be in Cedar Rapids. About a third of the time one year you'd be in Iowa City 4 months, and the next year 2, and then you'd be out in the rural counties when you weren't there. It was a very good district, and the traveling was not bad, because the trip to Anamosa only took me less than an hour.
It always struck me as a well-organized district, that the administration of it kept the judges busy but not overwhelmed. Is that sort of your...
That's what I believe. However, the judges that are not there now are bitterly complaining to me that they're overworked and so forth. But I don't think they keep the same, and if any of the judges happen to see this, pardon me, but I don't think they keep quite the same hours that the judges did when we were there. We had some excellent judges: Hal Viator, Ansel Chapman, who was a great judge, an older gentleman by the name of Clint Schaefer, who was a Cedar Rapids practitioner, but who was a small firm, common sense, a great judge.
John Hyland.
John Hyland was a good judge. He was strict, but he also was fair, and he was a good legal scholar.
Any particular district court trials that you remember or relish or want to share with us? Anything that happened in them?
Well, a couple of funny things happened to me.
Please.
I can. 2 days in a row, this happened to me when I was out in the rural counties, and I don't think it ever happened to anybody else out there before or since. But I was in Benton County on Thursday, I believe it was, and I sentenced a guy into the county jail, and the deputy wasn't watching him very closely, and all of a sudden he was gone out of the courtroom. And I adjourned court, and I looked out the huge bay window there, and I saw the guy running down the street. They caught him before he got out of town. They caught him at the edge of town. Someone had a police scanner and heard that, and saw him running by. He was still running 1.5 miles away. The next day I went to Tama County, and they brought a guy in on some type of a hearing, and his lawyer asked if he could talk to him, and they took him down to a jury room, and his lawyer come racing into the courtroom and said, "My client run away." And it took me a year and a half to find him.
That's something.
So I didn't know if it had anything to do with me or not.
Any interesting trials?
Oh, I had one other.
Sure.
I had a murder case over in Tama County, and the man shot his wife. We had a long sentencing hearing, and I invited my parent. My father had said he was coming over to buy some tractor parts in Tama that week, and I said, "Come on over on Thursday afternoon. I've got a sentencing, and you can listen to it." And he did, and my mother came along, and they couldn't believe what they heard, that this poor man had shot his wife. And he seemed like my mother said, such a nice young man. Well, I sentenced him. I had no alternative. Sentenced him to 50 years in the penitentiary. The next year, the judges were touring the Anamosa Reformatory, and I got there late because I had a hearing that took a long time, but they gave me the kind of follow-up tour of the place. And all of a sudden I heard someone calling my name, and I looked over, and here it was this gentleman. And he rushed up and he says, "I want to shake your hand." He said, "I am really appreciative. You did the right thing, and it's the best thing that ever happened to me." And to me, it was kind of amazing. He went on to explain that he had joined AA, and he had done some other things and taken a lot of counseling. And I assured him that I thought that was great, but there wasn't anything that I could help him on his sentence. And he says, "I know you can't." So he was sincere about it. And to me, that was
reassuring.
It was reassuring. I felt much better. And I think my mother was right. He was a nice guy, but he made a terrible mistake.
Yes, he sure did. Interesting. What about any commercial trials that you recall with any kind of... You were involved in 335, and we're going to get to the appeals, but trials of any note that you like to share with us at all?
When I appeared before the Judicial Nominating Commission, they asked me what my experience was, and I said, "I think I've probably been involved in everything that'll come up before me next year." And how wrong I was. After about 3 months, I was assigned to equity. We had an equity docket like they do in Des Moines now at that time. And as a new judge at the start of the year, it seemed like I was in equity for 11 of the first 12 months that I was on the bench, because that equity was only at the last 3 months, but everybody went on their vacations when they were in equity. Well, I picked up 2 equity matters that I had never had anything to do with before. One of them was a civil rights case. Quite frankly, I didn't even know there was a Civil Rights Act on the books. And I remember Roxanne Conlon coming down and prosecuting those. And I spent a lot of time in the library at the University of Iowa Law School. That it was a very interesting case. It involved a black man who had complained that he had been discriminated against because of his, he couldn't pass the test to get a promotion with, I don't know who, I think it was Wilson Packing. There was a U.S. Supreme Court case exactly, and they were trying it on the basis of that case, and he'd even taken the same test that had been thrown out at the U.S. Supreme Court, disapproved of, but there was one major difference, and that was that the black man in Pennsylvania, I believe, in the federal case, had been in segregated schools all his life and had had a lot of disadvantages. This young man came from a good family, attended all all not desegregated schools, had a good education. He just had a heck of a time passing the mechanical aptitude test he was taking. And I ruled against him, and the Iowa Supreme Court affirmed me on it, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused denied cert, and by the time all that things had happened, he'd passed the test and he'd had the job he wanted to, so everybody was happy.
That's great. Let me share an anecdote I have of you, and because what convinced me that you were a terrific judge, and see if you'd like to talk about this or your strategy as a judge and your attitude toward lawyers and things. I appeared before you in a dissolution of marriage case for one of my partner's sisters. She had been married to a lawyer in Cedar Rapids and had left to go live with her parents in San Diego. She had to wait a year before she could file for divorce, but her husband accommodated her by filing in Cedar Rapids, and we got ready to try the case. The husband naturally wanted her to come back from San Diego in the middle of winter, so we had to get it specially set anyway, so it got set for a cold January day, and I came over the night before to negotiate with the husband's lawyer, and did that evening, and thought that I had successfully negotiated a settlement in the case. And the lawyer on their side suggested that we go to the Lynn County Courthouse first thing the next morning and explain to the presiding judge that we had it settled, and go back and finish the papers and then come over and prove up the dissolution, which we did. We went to the Lynn County Courthouse early in the morning, and we met with you, who was assigned to the case, and told you the circumstances, and you agreed that would be fine. Come over later with the papers, and we would and you would let me prove up the case with my client. I went back to the lawyer's office, and lo and behold, he started negotiating again, and what we had agreed to the night before was not what he was willing to do at that point. After about 45 minutes or an hour of this, he then said to me, well, he would have to, we just were at an impasse, and we would have to call the court and see what went on. And so he did, and he called you, and I only heard one side of the conversation, but when the phone call was done, the lawyer turned to me and he said, well, Judge Schultz has said, come over, he will stop the case he's doing now, and he will start this one. So meet you over there. So I packed up my bags and had my client with me, who at this point was terribly depressed and probably thought I wasn't much of a lawyer, and headed back to the courthouse in Lynn County on the island there, and came to your chambers and went in and apologized for the circumstances and sat down, and after about 10-15 minutes or so, the lawyer from the other side came in and he handed me the papers that we had been fighting over and said his client had agreed to it, and he was willing to do it, and signed them and hand them to me. And you asked me if that was acceptable, and I said yes. And the lawyer on the other side then left, and I looked at you and said, well, Judge Schultz, you knew something here I didn't. And you just smiled at me and said, well, go get your client, Dick. Let's go out in the courtroom and prove this up. You really saved my bacon in the whole process, and I've looked back on that as a model of what a judge ought to be about, not to let lawyers take advantage of the circumstances like that, but to try to ensure that justice is done and that things keep moving in the judicial system. So I've always been grateful personally for that, but more than that, it taught me what I thought a good judge ought to be about and how a judge ought to conduct affairs. And I personally want to thank you, but I've always thought of that, and I've told that story to a lot of people, and always get a very warm response to that, is yes, that's what a judge ought to be. Would you like to share any more of that with us, or your judicial temperament or philosophy?
Dick, you were much younger then. You were a young lawyer.
Well, that's true.
And I can tell you this, I knew the lawyers in Lynn County very well because I'd practiced and tried cases or been around most of them before I went on the bench, and you get acquainted real quickly. And you had somebody who thought he had a young opponent he could push around and an out-of-state client, right?
Yes.
And we just fixed that by saying, we'll go ahead and try the case right now. And he thought that he had got it bumped out, I'm sure, and when he knew that he wasn't going to get it bumped, he was much more affable about settling the case. And I'm not saying anything disparaging about the other lawyer, because was a good friend of mine. He was a good lawyer, but he could push people around if he thought he'd get by out of it.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think, but
I want to add one other thing.
Sure.
Thank you for the nice compliment. I don't know if it's deserved or not, but
it is. But beyond that, you want to share any more of your judicial philosophy with you while you were on the district court bench?
I think I liked lawyers, and I respected their clients, and I think if you do have an admiration for lawyers, but also if you're a little bit if you start getting pushed around, you stamp your foot down and don't allow it to happen. I think that lawyers appreciate that, and I think they spend a lot of time. I know I did when I was practicing, trying to figure out the judge. But if they think you're going to be fair with them and you're going to treat them courteously, but you're not going to be pushed around, I think it helps. And that was my philosophy with them. Every time a lawyer did a good job in court, and sometimes not so good a job, I always thanked them for their professionalism, and I was always careful to do that in front of their clients, and because I wanted their clients to, one of them was going to lose, and I at least wanted the loser to think that I thought his lawyer was a good lawyer, and this is something I did. I had some judges do that to me when I practiced, and I always appreciated it. And sometimes I didn't do that, but it was usually because I would have not been telling the truth if I. But most of the lawyers were great to get along with, as long as you tried to treat them fairly.
Speaking of losing cases, I mean, it's easy to resolve winning a case. But if we all lose cases from time to time, how did you take it? How did you handle it?
I had a good situation. My senior partner was an extreme advocate and always thought we were going to win every case. And we didn't lose many because we prepared a lot harder than the other side. But when we did lose a case, it took him maybe a month to 6 weeks
to get over it. And I would be feeling so sorry for him that I'd forget about the fact that we lost the case. And I can remember going back to his office about a month after a case was over, and he wasn't getting anything done in the office, and he was moping around. And I went and pulled his blinds up, and I said, I'm going to let the sun shine in because you're going to live, Paul. And we're going to try some more cases. And he started laughing, and he was okay from then. And after Paul got out of the picture of trying cases, I had a younger partner who still is the head of that firm out there. And he was a tremendous winner and a sore loser. And he didn't blame it on the judges or on to anything, that he just would mope. And I had the same thing. But no, I never liked getting beat, and I never even liked losing emotion. If I thought I was right, it also brings up another thing. Back
when I first started practicing law, we were under the old judicial system before, where judges were elected. And we had a practice that did extend into 2 other judicial districts. And you lost more cases away from home than you did home. And the judges had 2 standards, especially up in Benton County, the district of Benton, Tama, and Marshalltown. The one judge just was, if you took a probate file up to him to get an order, he'd ask why you were handling it in Benton County when you had, they had all these good lawyers. Of course, he always kept his door open, and there was a big coffee urn there, and all the lawyers would sit around, and he was giving you hell about something for the benefit of those other lawyers. And this was a different world, and Orville Blathy and I were the only 2 lawyers in Iowa County that worked hard to get the
redistricting?
No, not the redistricting, to get the Constitution changed to take them out of politics.
To the appointment.
And our 2 judges condemned us and gave us hell at bar meetings, and but we lived through it, and we got the system, and it is much better today.
I agree. I think that's right.
And one other funny story, I know this is getting too long, and you can cut it out, but the first time I went to Benton County as a district judge, I went into that same office and sat in that same chair beside the same judge, and the first lawyer came in and said how wonderful it was that I got appointed. I said, I haven't been waiting for many years to get behind this desk in this office in this building. And I thought that he was going to faint, and the noise out in the coffee room got very quiet, and then when I leaned back and started laughing, they knew I'd pulled one on them.
That's good. I think you're right. The Missouri system, as they call it, this appointment through nominating commissioners, did a great thing for our bench, I think. It really helped.
No, I would have never been a judge on the old elective system.
Yeah. Well, have we got you up to the Supreme Court here?
I think I've drug it along.
Okay, fine. You get nominated for the Iowa Supreme Court in 1980. I don't know who you were paired with.
Jim Carter and Judge Haverkamp from
Davenport.
Jim was on the Court of Appeals at that time, and Judge Haverkamp was a chief judge out in Scott County.
Okay, and did you make it the first time?
Yes.
Okay, and that is something I've tried to stress in these interviews, and that is 3 good people are always nominated.
The other 2, Jim made it the next year, and Haverkamp decided he'd rather be chief judge.
Okay, and so losing is not much of an onus. It's because of the 3 good people.
No, and Jim was the next one that got placed on the court. We were district court judges together for several years. We'd tried cases against each other back in the practice. I was a little older than Jim. We've always been very good friends, very close friends. Probably my best friend on the Supreme Court. And when we got into conferences on cases, every once in a while, we usually thought pretty much alike, but every once in a while we'd disagree. And when that happened, it was probably the most vigorous arguments of the month or maybe the year would go on, and we would battle back and forth. And I remember one time one of the other justices that I shall not name, but who later on became Chief Justice, intervened and said, Justice Carter, you are, to the effect, you're getting a little carried away. And I started laughing. I said, just let us finish this.
That's good. Okay, at some point you moved to Iowa City from Marengo?
We did when our son was in college, because my wife had gone to work to help pay that tuition at Grinnell, and she got a job over at Family Practice Office in Oakdale, and she was traveling one way and I was another, and I decided that it was easier for us to move than for her to get another job. And it was kind of nice having that income, because in actuality she was paying Mark's tuition at Grinnell.
Sure. Well, it's no small feat these days. Okay, well, we have 335 opinions you wrote from 1980 to 1993. If you'd like to talk about them, or would you like to talk about judicial philosophy? What would you like to... Maybe let me ask it this way before we get started. When you went on the bench and in your career as a Supreme Court justice, did you find it to be a lonely existence?
Much lonelier than the district court, and it especially was for me because I had my the University of Iowa Law School provided me an office, but they didn't have room in their old law school. Excuse me, and they placed me. They had several rooms down at the old
Jefferson Hotel.
Jefferson Hotel, and that was not too fancy a quarters, but it was adequate. But it was lonely up there. I would carry my lunch every day, and I'd go down and sit on the plaza and watch the students parade back and forth. And you had a law clerk, and I had a half-time secretary, and for at least 3 to 3.5 weeks a month I'd be in that office, and it was different. And I was used to seeing a lot of people and a lot of things happening, and I wondered if I hadn't made a mistake. But as time went along, I got into the law school. The new law school was finished, and they had a nice office for me there, and that was delightful, because I'd go to there's programs almost every week. Some renowned person comes in, usually a lawyer or a law professor or a U.S. Supreme Court justice or thing, and they would have programs, and I'd go to those, and I was invited to take part in all the faculty proceedings, which changed my outlook on loneliness. And I might add one thing, and that is that when I moved in there, Dean Hines said to me, we used to have a Supreme Court justice in our building.
Larson.
And he said he spent an awful lot of time with professors asking them questions. And he said, I want you to know that you can do what you want, but law school professors have their prejudice also. And I said, thank you. And I think he must have talked to the professors, because the entire time that I was in that office, I never had one professor ever question me about a decision, or they treated me like I didn't write opinions, and I never went to them to get their advice, because I didn't think that would be correct. And
let's take a break here. Justice Schultz, I think up to now we've gotten you on the Supreme Court in 1980. Can you tell us about how what you decided to do when you first got there? Did you? I take it you're the most junior member, and you replaced Warren Reese.
That's right.
Did you get any parting words of advice from Justice Reese?
I never even saw him at the time. He had gone on a vacation or something, and I'd known Justice Reese for several years, quite a few years, because I had tried cases under him. He was a marvelous trial judge.
And the last of the what they called cookbook lawyers, he had not gone to law school?
I think he had gone one semester, maybe. But I think he took some correspondence courses, and he went in with a good law firm, and that was never a handicap to him. I think it was internally with him, because a couple of times he kind of half apologized to me that he didn't go to law school. But he was a tremendous trial lawyer, and he was one. The old-time lawyers, when I first started practicing, most of them were storytellers. They handled so many situations with a good story that seemed to be appropriate to the circumstances, and Warren was one of the greatest on this. He was a fine gentleman, and although he didn't go to even a 2-year law school, he was a very good lawyer. And I was a big disappointment to the other members of the court when I went on, because I was not a storyteller. I was a story listener. But I think I learned something the first month I went on. I got assigned 3 cases, and one of them was a case where Ansel Chapman, who had been a mentor of mine, and a man who, as a district judge, I tried cases before and I admired greatly, one of his cases, and I looked at that and I said, Ansel, you made a mistake. When I'm reading, you goofed. And I called up the chief and I said, I'd like to trade this case with someone else. And he said, why? And I said, because. And I explained to him my relationship with Ansel. And he said, better you do it than somebody else. Yeah. And then I asked the other members on my panel if one of them wouldn't trade me. And no one would trade. And so the second or third case that got filed in the books, I wrote an opinion reversing Ansel. Ansel never said a word to me, and I never said a word to him when I'd see him. But he retired a few years later, and he asked me to be the main speaker. And and he introduced me, and he said, I want you to know that this is the man. The first case that I saw of his come down was one of my cases, and he reversed me. And he turned around to me, and he said, Lou, when I read that opinion, he said, I was wrong. And he said, I knew it. And, that was, I had a fast learning that just because you liked the judge down below, it didn't mean a darn thing when you were acting as an appellate judge.
Okay, and you tell us about favorite opinions you had?
Well, I'll tell you my favorite last.
Okay.
There were a couple of cases. I enjoyed cases that involved people, private citizens, who had been wronged by someone, usually the government, in some way, or maybe a company or other things. But I always got a greater delight if I could rule in their favor, and those were my favorite cases. I remember I wrote opinions on a couple of hog disposal problems where the hog farms that are raising a lot of pigs have to haul this slurry out, and one of them spread this slurry within yards of 2 homes owned by a couple of elderly people that lived in these homes years before he ever started his hog operation. And the evidence was that the odors were offensive and it permeated their houses and so forth. And I wrote an opinion on enjoining him, I think, from about a quarter of a mile away. And darned if I didn't get another one of those cases a couple of years later, where a woman had married this old farmer, and she'd been a retired school teacher in Omaha and moved out the farm, and they built a beautiful patio and a place for entertaining, and she had all of her friends invited out from Omaha and was going to have a big outing in the summertime. And the day before, this farmer had gone out and plastered the acreage next to their place, and she had to call off her party. And in both cases, we enjoined them. Now, I'm not against hog farmers. I grew up on a farm, but I also grew up among people who were neighborly, and these were not neighborly acts. One of the first opinions that I had written was on a civil rights case involving discrimination against a handicapped person. And it was a case that came up out of Des Moines, and this woman had epilepsy. I really felt that this woman had done some things wrong. She didn't disclose this on her employment application. But it was one case, and I usually was on the, probably my philosophy was against some things, but I took some pride in writing the opinion that said that epilepsy was a handicap and that it was involved in this case, and they could accommodate her. I mean,
it's a very tough set of facts.
It was tough set, but I can. I hit it right on the nail. I felt the principle was rather important.
Sure.
One of the things I liked about being on the court the most was if I didn't agree with the others, the majority of the people in my division or on the court, I'd write dissents, and I usually wrote very short ones. And one of my law clerks called it to my attention a few years ago that I had written 6 dissents in a 2-month period when he was with me. And frankly, I don't remember all the details, never thought much about it. But we ended up, after those 2 months, having 6 new cases to write. Each one of my dissents got a majority, and he says, we had 9 opinions to write 1 month. I think he was wrong. I can't imagine there being that many, but I did enjoy writing dissents, and I do know down through the 13 years that I was on the court that not quite a few, but several of my dissents turned out to be majority opinions. And if you're a little bit combative, as any old trial lawyer is, you always get a little bit of a charge, even when you're on the Supreme Court, if you have upset somebody and taken something away from them. Mm-hmm. You know, it might be a sedate group, but we're all a little competitive.
Sure.
Probably the favorite case I have is a case that arose up in northwest Iowa, and the facts were that this lady lived on a farm that had either been I believe it was her grandfather or great-grandfather had settled it, and he bought it from the government, the farm, and he could, because it was treeless up there, they had a provision that if he would plant 10 acres of timber, that he could get the farm either for free or for almost free. And he did that. He went to the Missouri River 30-some miles away with wagons and dug up a lot of cottonwood trees and planted 10 acres of cottonwoods. And that was in the around 1870. It wasn't settled up there as early as the rest of Iowa. Mm-hmm. And back in 1995 or whenever this came up, or in the 90s, those trees were still standing, or about 30 of them were. The whole 10 acres was not there. And they were along the highway. They were 80 feet tall, and you could see them up there on that flat land for 8 miles. And the county engineer said, I'm going to improve that road that's run by your place, so we're going to have to take those trees out. And she said, you can't do that. And she had a brother also, and they apparently gave him a lot of trouble, and it made the engineer apparently wasn't too pleased with it. And she said, those are our trees. My grandfather got lost in a snowstorm, a blizzard, and he used those trees to guide him back to where he could crawl in a straw stack and stay overnight so he wouldn't freeze to death. And she said that we got a tremendous attachment to him. He found out she was leaving for a 2-week trip out west. And when she came home, all the trees had been cut down. One of her cousins was a very fine lawyer in Sioux City, and he did a tremendous job of researching out the history of that road. And lo and behold, it had not been properly taken care of back in the 1870s when the road was put in. It had not had one of the notices published in something else, and the district court wrote a very fine opinion saying that the county didn't own those trees. They had an easement for the road, but they never took care of the ditches and the fence beyond the ditches, and consequently that property was still theirs. And he awarded damages for that case, and we affirmed him on that. But the parties appealed. He said the district court just figured out the square footage of the lumber, and that's what they gave us, plus treble damages. And we think we should be entitled to more damages, and our court held, and I wrote the opinion that the extensive use, including the attachment they had to those trees, was an item of damages. We reversed the case, sent it back for a trial on that issue, and she and her brother got another $30,000 or $40,000. And as a closing thing, that story, after I retired, I think it was a lawyer that was involved in it, or one of them in his firm, told me that when they received the money, they donated it to a society for the preservation of land and trees and so forth up in their home county. And they never, I imagine that they took out the attorney fees they paid. Maybe the cousin worked for free, I'm not sure. But to me, that's what justice is all about. And I was very proud to be a part of it.
I certainly get that impression when you talk. You're not talking about what I call big money cases. You're talking about principles that matter.
Mm-hmm.
That's very good.
But I enjoyed my time on the court. At first I had some doubts about it, but now, especially since I've retired and look back and once in a while look at some of the opinions that came down, I feel very, very proud to have been a part of the process. And I'm very proud to be a part of the Iowa bar and the judges of the state, because in going to national meetings, and I'm sure you have also, I think ours is second to none.
Tell me, you served under Chief Justice Reynoldson and then Chief Justice McGivern in your 13 years on the bench, on the Supreme Court bench. You saw some changes. There were some efforts to reorganize the judicial process while you were there. Did you participate in any of that?
Oh yes. Some of it was done before I went on the court, but I was involved in some of the measures were done during my tenure on the bench. Chief Justice Reynoldson did a marvelous job, and sometimes when you change things, you irritate some people, but he had a vision of what the best thing would be for the court system and for the lawyers, and he worked hard to get it done, and he did a great job. And even though he ruffled some feathers as he went along, but he was a great Chief Justice. And he followed a great one who happened to be my old law school practice court teacher when he was district court judge, Edwin Moore. And Arthur McGivern was a fine Chief Justice. Carried on the tradition very well, and I'm sure Lou Alvarado is now. Lou is a very good justice, and I'm sure he's doing a great job. I think this building that we're in right now is a testament to that.
What about changes that you saw? Do you want to comment on any of the changes you saw in the practice of law as you observed it from your vantage points?
There's a tremendous amount of change. The flavor of the bar is much different now. When I first started out, you had a lot of old war horses who would fight to the death in the courtroom and then would adjourn and go out and socialize with their enemy during the day. There was a great collegiality between trial lawyers and all members of the bar. Lawyers did not take default judgments against another lawyer without calling him, and if he didn't do something, without putting it in writing, and they were very reluctant to do that. They also did not try to they'd fight like the Dickens in the courtroom, but they did not try to pull any real shenanigans, except they got a big kick out of presenting witnesses that the other side didn't know about, because in those days there was not the modern discovery. It was a different world as far as courtroom work. We had some old lawyers from Oskaloosa who came down our way. One of them was named Tom Bray, and I remember he had hearing aids on and walked with 2 canes when he was trying. But you could hear him across the street from the courthouse when he made a closing argument. He was a very good lawyer. And there was another fellow named Howard Life, and he was a colorful gentleman, very colorful, and he would give you a tussle.
You observed law students, I take it, for a period of time too, if you were in the University of Iowa Law School. Comments about how they've changed?
Well, the biggest change happened while I was first on the district court bench, or midway through. The young lawyers that were just starting to practice would come to court in 1971 and 2 with sandals on. And we had a couple of women lawyers who came with long calico dresses and maybe some kind of boots on. And they were mostly good lawyers, but they were a little eccentric. And all of a sudden in the mid-60s, or sometime, I mean in the mid-70s, somewhere along the line, all of a sudden the young lawyers graduating from law school all came in with 3-piece suits and were demanding higher fees than they were getting on court appointment cases, and it was a different atmosphere. Quite frankly, I loved some of those guys that came in with sandals and women because they really worked hard at representing their clients, and money didn't seem to mean a darn thing to them. They were there to do justice. Now sometimes their idea what justice was didn't mix with the court, but that is some of the changes. I think the present day lawyer have to be businessmen, and the lawyers really weren't businessmen when I started out. The only people that you did an hourly fee for, charged an hourly fee, were insurance companies and corporations. The rest of the clients, you figured up what the case was worth, how much money your client had, and things like that. You would tell them up front before you ever started what the fee was going to be.
A flat fee.
A flat fee, and you did it on those, and you had people you charged very little to, because they didn't have the funds to do it.
Do you have anecdotes about that from your private practice in Marengo? Cases you took like that?
My senior partner told me all the time that I wasn't charging enough, and he was right. And he told me, he said, they don't respect you if you don't charge enough. And this went on for 3 or 4 years, and he was right. One day, at a time when we had, and he had become ill, and we had 2 men's work that I was doing, and he wasn't very anxious to get in a 3rd partner or associate. I went in one day and I said, there's 3 clients that I just can't stand, because they come in and ask, they always ask, how can I get around this? It wasn't, how should I do it? And I said, all of them have money and they think they can push people around and so forth. And he said, I said, I think I'm just going to cut them off as clients. And he said, don't do that. He said, just double the fee that you charge anybody else for the same thing. And he said, tell them that you're doubling it because that that they want service right now and so forth and so on. I learned very quickly. They all 3 stayed. I did exactly what he said. And he was right. I was happier because I was getting much better fees. And the amazing thing was, I kept getting new clients. And I would usually ask someone, why did you come in? And those 3 people were telling everybody I was a hell of a lawyer, but I charged like the dickens.
That's delightful. Anything we've missed here that you'd like to talk about, Justice Schultz?
No, I don't think so.
Your family's doing well. You're probably a grandfather.
I have 7 grandchildren. The 2 oldest are now in college, and I got another one just starting. Those kids are much smarter than their grandfather, and I mean that literally. They're tremendous students, and they're doing things I never thought of doing at their age. Okay. So it's been a good life.
Well, that's good. We have a poem that you gave me before we started here, done by one of your former clerks, I believe, called Bangert versus Osceola County. Is this based on a case?
That's based on the case that I just said was my favorite case.
About the trees.
Mm-hmm.
Bangert versus Osceola County by Perry H. Nades. Introduction. Those of us who know Justice Schultz know of his love of the outdoors and his appreciation of nature's beauty. It comes as no surprise, then, that he considered his opinion in the Bangert case a labor of love. With apologies to Joyce Kilmer, I think that I have never read a sadder story of trees now dead that makes me shed a silent tear than the tale of Bangert, the Birkenpass, and the engineer. A county road far from town, the engineer said chop them down, 28 old cottonwood trees, standing tall for all to see. Wait until they've gone away. Sneak out in the next few days. Bring those buzz saws. Bring those chains. Make our road a safety lane for those 20 cars a day that travel down its right-of-way. I don't care what that old code says. It's our road, and I want them dead. I'm not a lawyer, but I know the trees are ours, and they've got to go. What he did not know, my tree-loving friends, was that this result was not the end. The family came home and missed its trees and sued that no Johnny Appleseed. The rest is precedent, you might say. The judge came in and saved the day. You nailed them petty sons of bitches and showed them trees are worth more than riches. There's one more thing I need to say. The register came in and marred the day. It told the story, that is true, but then it made one big boo-boo. It made an error for which it will ne'er be forgiven. It gave all the credit to Art McGivern.
Thank you very much, Justice Schultz, for a delightful interview. Sure appreciate it.